Hello and welcome to the Global Leadership Podcast. I'm Whitney Putnam, and around here, we believe that when a leader gets better, everyone wins. Whether you're leading a team, a classroom, a ministry, or just trying to lead yourself well through a hard season, you're in the right place. This is a space where we talk honestly about what it looks like to grow our influence in healthy, grounded, and lasting ways. And here's what I know about you if you're joining us today. You are driven and looking for ways to grow. You aren't going to accept the status quo, and you want to live a life that matters. You believe in expanding your influence for the greater good. And all that is great. It can also be so tiring. So can I just be real for a second inside of this community? Lately, I have found myself wanting to bring my absolute best to the work that I do, especially the creative, deep thinking, high focus kind of work that I do at the Global Leadership Network. But some days I just feel really tired. In fact, it's really impacted me this week with all of the big projects that we have with the summit coming up. And maybe you're feeling really tired too. If so, I want to introduce you to someone who's going to speak right into that tension. Dr. James Hewitt is a human performance scientist and founder of the Knowledge Work Lab, a high-performance consulting firm that helps some of the world's top-performing companies build rhythms of sustainable energy and well-being. What he's found is powerful, that cognitive work, the kind most of us do every day, is actually an endurance sport. And just like athletes need recovery, so do we. In this episode, James sits down with our GLN president and CEO, David Ashcraft, for a conversation that I know will resonate deeply. It's practical, insightful, and honestly, it gave me language for what I have been feeling. And here's the bonus. James will be joining us as a speaker at the 2025 Global Leadership Summit on August 7th and 8th. So if you're already planning to attend, consider this your sneak peek. And if you're not registered yet, well, now is a great time. Before we jump in, would you take a second to like, rate, and subscribe whenever you are listening to this episode? It's a simple way for us to help others discover this content, and it means a ton to us. All right, take a deep breath. You're doing better than you think. Let's dive into this conversation with James and David.
Hey, well, it's great to have James Hewitt with us today. James is a human performance scientist. And so, James, we'll have to get you to tell us what that means. But I know you are very focused on high performance for leaders, for individuals. Thank you for taking time, first of all, to be with us today. Appreciate it very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here.
And we're doing this. You're actually in Chicago. The home is England, the UK for you. Am I correct on that?
Yes, that's right. So I live in Cambridge in the UK, but I'm over here in Chicago for another event. So I took the opportunity to come and see the space, and I think I'm not far from your office here in Chicago, funnily enough.
I think you're actually sitting in my office in Chicago, and I'm in Pennsylvania at this time. But technology is great, so thank you. Appreciate you joining us very much. So
yeah, you're welcome.
So James, describe a little bit, when we talk about high performance, how did you even get into this work of analyzing, evaluating, helping people figure out how to perform well in their functions? How did you end up here in this specific topic?
So, for as long as I can remember, I've always loved anything that goes fast. So, space rockets, racing cars, anything with wheels. And in my teens, I discovered this sport, road cycling, racing, where you can hit speeds of 100 kilometers an hour on tires just a few centimeters thick. And anyway, that led me to pursue a career in cycling. I tried to become a professional cyclist and spent several years in the south of France chasing that dream. Unfortunately, it didn't work out.
So just like Tour de France type racing?
Exactly. Yeah. So road bikes in the mountains, big packs of riders. Over hundreds of kilometers. And that's really where that passion for performance first began. But it was definitely at that point about my own performance. To cut a long story short, when my career didn't work out, I went back to university. I set up a coaching business, as many failed athletes do. But not always. Don't want to talk down coaches, but that was the story for me. And I found that even though I was really passionate about working with elite and professional riders, most of my clients ended up being amateurs. So this was, 2000s. People were trying to be Lance Armstrong. So, they were investment bankers from Monday to Friday, working 80 hours a week, and then wanted to go and ride 180 miles over the weekend. But I realized during that time that I had to somehow incorporate the load associated with their working life to plan their physical training effectively. And for me, performance had always been a simple equation in some ways. It had been about trying to understand the demands of the challenge that they were facing, the capabilities they needed to meet those demands, understand the gap between the capabilities and demands today, and then figure out a plan to plug that gap. And I started to apply that same model, that performance model, to their working lives, and to understand, the days that they were pushing harder, maybe the days that they were life was easier, and push them harder physically on the days that they didn't need to work so hard mentally, and came up eventually with this model of thinking about knowledge work. So that's work where we think for a living, the work of consultants, of project managers, the work of leaders, often as a cognitive endurance activity, in a similar way that you might think about cycling like a physical endurance activity. And so this journey of performance about how do we help people to reach their potential? Initially it was about me as an athlete. Eventually it was about athletes, amateur athletes as a coach. And then it became about thinking about their potential as leaders and as business people in the workplace. The red thread through that has always been about understanding what people are capable of, and how can we provide the environment, the tools, the skills, the resources, the people around them to help them to achieve that.
So I'm assuming, because you were able to make that shift from the physical side to the cognitive side, that the principles that you were learning from the physical side definitely carried over and applied to in the same way, or was it very different? Was it a big leap for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there are obviously important differences between cognitive work and physical work. And sometimes we can make the mistake of trying to apply lessons from sport into the workplace without recognizing the limitations. So, for example, Olympic athletes, world-class athletes, have entire teams supporting them, and they're working towards these very clearly prescribed goals with very clear outcomes. They'll know whether they get on the podium or not. The workplace is quite abstract often, particularly for knowledge work. However, I do think there are some general principles that underpin performance for both athletes, for business people, for sports people and leaders. And I would say that if you were to look at people who are able to sustain high performance over the long term, there's often three characteristics that they have in common, whether this was in an athletic context or a business context. One is that they are efficient and effective. Second, they're decisive and focused. And third, they're energized and they're well rested. And we can kind of unpack what each of those principles mean, but I think they're three generalizable principles, characteristics, which
both sides. They cover both sides, both physical and cognitive.
For both athletes and business people, both physically and cognitively.
Yeah, so I'd love to have you unpack those. And even will you also define for us, James, when you talk about high performance, what does that even mean? How would somebody know if I am performing, if they are performing at a level you'd call a high performance level? And I know that in the business world, and even for an athlete, when you were doing your road cycling, immense pressure to be at your highest. And so does that even change one's ability? Does that pressure affect the ability to even perform at a high level? And so define some of that for us, if you would. And then I'd love to hear those three different principles that you learned there.
Well, for me, performance is about being able to meet the demands that you're facing, whether those demands are in life or in work. But I think sometimes we make the mistake of believing that performance is a one-off, or it's a specific point that we're aiming towards. I tend to actually conceptualize performance more as boundaries, as bands. So if you've got demands that you're facing and you're trying to meet those demands, there's probably an upper and a lower bound in terms of what meeting them mean. So and it's like a performance review. There's a meet, there's an exceed, there's a fail to meet expectations. And actually, if you were to think about that in the context of a working day, for example, you might have a proposal that you're working on. Performance in that context might mean thinking carefully about how to articulate an idea in a way that your client is going to understand. Now, there's going to be an exceed version of that. There's going to be an acceptable. There's going to be a fail to meet the target. But then what I do is kind of what's called like decompose it, break it down and say, what capabilities are actually required to be able to deliver that proposal and perform? So we might think, well, there's complex problem solving involved. There's sustained attention when you're actually producing that piece of work. There's going to be collaboration that's required, maybe to get ideas from different team members. So performance, that outcome we're aiming for, meet the demands of being able to deliver that proposal, is actually built on this foundation of different elements. And then we start to think about what different qualities are required, what type of environment is needed to make sure that those different capabilities, those building blocks, can be expressed at their full potential. And looking at that then over time and accepting that, with those bounds, we're never going to be able to hit that top all the time, but being clear about when you really need to and when actually just a meet rather than exceed is acceptable. Because I think the mistake that we sometimes make is we believe that we can be performing at this exceed level permanently, and actually we can't, and it's probably not even necessary. So it's recognizing that as human beings, we are biological organisms, we're not machines.
Yeah. So again, you mentioned three things. And so describe a little bit those that will help a person. You're saying it takes those three things, whether it's physical, whether it's cognitive, to be able to perform at a high level.
Yeah, and I think one of your other questions as well is, what does a leader need in terms of those capabilities to perform at a high level? And because, I think about those three things being efficient, effective, decisive focus, energized and well rested. And why do those matter? And they matter, I think, because as a leader, if you think about what you're trying to achieve, some of it is about, as I said, complex problem solving. It might be called productive efficiency, generating new insights. So you've got to think a different way because you're leading people somewhere. If you just default to the old ways, then what are you actually leading? And then also emotional intelligence. And it's interesting, there was a study done a few years ago, and from memory, I think they polled about 190,000 people in over 80 countries. And they found actually that those four capabilities that I just described, so generation of new insights, the complex problem solving, productive efficiency, emotional intelligence, 89% of the difference in terms of leadership effectiveness between strong and weak organizations was described by those four capabilities. And so I think it was a McKinsey study that you'd be able to find that described that. So if we say, okay, well, those four things kind of represent the performance outcomes, the demands that we're aiming for, how do those three principles, efficiency and effectiveness, decisiveness and focus, being energized and well rested, feed into that? And so if we think, for example, if we just look at complex problem solving, for example, the energized and well rested element is perhaps the most important one. And so there's some really interesting research, for example, that describes how when we don't sleep adequately, so we can talk about what this means, but unfortunately that means if we're not sleeping an average of 7 hours per night at least, our problem solving ability can reduce by over 60%. And that was based on standardized kind of problem solving tasks. But also there's an issue with emotional intelligence. So when leaders specifically don't sleep enough, team members rate their environments as less psychologically safe. And so again, that's going to compromise that capability of being emotionally intelligent. And one of the reasons for this is that sleep is absolutely critical for the processing of social emotions. So when we sleep in these different phases. So non-REM sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. And they've done some really elegant experiments where you can selectively deprive people of these different sleep stages. And if you stop people getting REM sleep, their emotional intelligence, their ability to process social emotions is really impaired. So if you're looking at a leader who says, okay, my performance demands are to be emotionally intelligent, that's going to be enabled by being efficient, energized and well rested. And we know that sleep is a critical component about that. Let's have a look at how you're sleeping right now and maybe think about whether you're sleeping adequately, whether your sleep is high quality. And if not, what do we need to do to create that environment where you're going to be able to achieve that sleep you need?
So fascinating.
Systematically.
Yeah, fascinating from a couple different standpoints, because probably when the leader is under the most pressure or they're at their busiest state, then sleep is one of the first things that's deprived. And so instantly you're not up to your best in those intense situations because you're missing out on the sleep, which is interesting.
Absolutely.
How does that jive, James, when we hear stories, and maybe it's just more anecdotal stories of these leaders and these brilliant people that are sleeping 4 hours a night and sleep is not necessary? So how does this research that you're talking about jive with those? Are those just individual stories that are one-offs?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I mean, I think the first thing you described there is, this paradox that when leaders need to be most emotionally intelligent in a crisis, for example, that's probably where their sleep is most limited. And I sometimes describe this as the leadership paradox. Often the capabilities that leaders need the most are the most compromised by leadership demands. So how do we tackle that? Well, there are ways we can address it, but to your question specifically about these kind of outliers, are they kind of invulnerable to the leadership paradox? Well, there are a very small number of people who can perform adequately on fewer than 7 hours of sleep, even significantly less. And they have a mutation on a gene called DEC2. It's a gene that's related to our body clock, called our circadian rhythm. And they have this genetic predisposition to be able to perform adequately. However, the prevalence of that genetic mutation is very rare. So if you think about, the amazing room that the summit is held in, 7,000 people, statistically, you'd probably expect to have like 1.1 people in that room might have that gene. It's very, very rare. It's like 0.05, I think. So very low prevalence. Unfortunately, for most people, they're just not aware of how inadequate sleep is influencing them. And there's several studies that describe this, but a really seminal one, a really foundational one was led by a researcher called Van Dongen and his colleagues. And they controlled people's sleep in 3 different conditions. Unlucky group didn't get sleep at all. Then another group was slept for 4 hours per night for 2 weeks. Another group 6 hours, another group 8 hours. And during all of their waking hours, they measured their cognitive performance. But in particular, they were looking for their error rate. So what they found was, as you'd expect, the group whose sleep was completely impaired, that they didn't get sleep at all, their error rate increased really, really quickly. And obviously, they didn't keep that going for 2 weeks. The lucky group who slept for 8 hours per night, very stable performance, weren't making a lot of errors. The interesting thing for me is that group who slept for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, they were making as many errors as if they'd gone an entire night without sleep. However, they also measured how sleepy and impaired those different groups felt. And despite the fact that 6 hours per night group were performing as if they'd gone an entire night without sleep, they didn't feel that much more sleepy and impaired than the 8 hours per night group. So the finding, and I'm sure you're kind of getting this, but the outcome of this is that often we're performing at an impaired level without realizing it. And I think this is true of leaders too. And what I see with high performers in particular isn't that they're necessarily impaired in terms of their output. They often still get the job done, but they have to put in so much more effort to get there. And sometimes there's collateral damage as well. And often you see the collateral damage because they perform like they need to at work. They meet their professional targets. They're within those performance bands that we talked about. They meet it. Sometimes they even exceed. But then unfortunately, it's the people around them who get the worst of them. I know I've been there. You get home, with your wife, with your kids, in my context, and I've been emotionally intelligent and very present all day, and I get back, and my wife says, "James, do you mind just having a look at this thing?" And I'm like, oh, they get the worst of me because I've convinced myself I'm fine, but actually I'm not.
So you may have just answered my next question, because my experience with a lot of leaders is everybody listening to this is going to assume they're in that 1%.
Yeah.
And so I was going to say, how do you, on a practical level, point out to somebody they're in the 99%, and maybe it's just what's breaking down relationally, or are there ways that a person can identify and realize I'm not in that 1%, I am deprived of sleep?
Well, the simplest thing is to ask yourself 2 questions. So the first question is this: could you wake up at roughly the time that you'd need to if you didn't have an alarm? And the second question is, can you get through the average day without feeling too sleepy, without relying on stimulants like caffeine or stress? If you answer no to one of those questions, you'd probably benefit from getting some more sleep.
Okay.
The final test is this: it's how long do you sleep when you're on vacation? Because I've met so many people who convince themselves that they're in this kind of this minority who have this genetic phenotype on this DC2 gene. But if you have that mutation, then you're a short sleeper all the time. You'll never you won't sleep longer at weekends. You certainly wouldn't do on vacations, for example.
Yeah.
And most leaders who I've spoken to are convinced they're in that group. And I say, well, what happens when you're on vacation? Once you've wound down, you've been away for a few days. Oh yeah, I sleep longer then. I say, well, you're not in that group, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Which I'm sure they don't want to hear that. So yeah.
No, never.
Yeah. So are you almost saying, James, one of the best ways that we can improve our performance is just adequate sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I sometimes say is that a high performance day begins the night before, because sleep is the foundation for so many aspects of well-being and sustained high performance. Those 4 capabilities that I described that explain 89% of the difference between strong and weak leadership in terms of their leadership effectiveness. But also, so many fundamental aspects of our health. I mean, there's some really concerning statistics, for example, which describe how when we don't sleep adequately, our metabolism, or the chemical reactions in our body, start to behave in a way that you'd expect to see if someone was type 2 diabetic. And you also see things like appetite dysregulation. So when we don't sleep enough, the following day, we're likely to overeat. In fact, if you sleep fewer than 7 hours, you tend to eat about 400 calories more the next day, because there's this disruption in the hormones that regulate appetite, something called ghrelin and leptin. And so many of the challenges that we see in relation to wellbeing and performance, you can track back to a root in adequate quality sleep, or the lack thereof.
Interesting. Which is funny, because that's in some ways such a simple thing to do, and yet it's also difficult to discipline ourselves to take that time. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a whole load of interesting phenomena around that psychologically, where, I think very often we frame rest as a reward, particularly as leaders. And also we frame kind of the lack of rest as part of our self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
And, there is a time for that. But the problem is, it's if that exception becomes the norm. And so I often say, rest is not a reward. It's what makes great work possible.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
It's an important reframing for many of us, I think.
Hey everybody, it's Eric, content producer for the Global Leadership Podcast. Listen, if the conversation with James Hewitt is lighting something up inside you today, I want to ask you to imagine what 2 full days of content like this could do. That's exactly what you get at the Global Leadership Summit, which is happening August 7th and 8th. It's one of the most energizing, practical leadership events out there. And James is just one of the many voices who will challenge and equip you. You'll also hear from Nick Saban, John Acuff, Christine Kane, John Maxwell, and more. Right now, early bird pricing is still available, but only until July 17th. On that day, ticket prices will go up, so don't wait. Head over right now to globalleadership.org/summit and grab your seat today. And now, back to the episode with Dr. James Hewitt.
So, James, some of this maybe goes back to our school days and the legendary all-nighters that people would pull to finish term papers or to study for exams and things like that. And maybe that just carries over on into our business lives as well. But as you're trying to help people figure out, because, again, it probably makes sense to say lack of sleep is going to affect my physical performance, but cognitively I should be fine. But obviously the evidence is saying not at all. And adequate sleep is incredibly critical just to be at the top of our game cognitively.
Absolutely. And it even creeps up on us quickly. So there was an interesting other study done quite a few years ago where they compared the effect of how long you've been awake for, so prolonged wakefulness, with alcohol consumption. A really fun study, because they actually got people to ingest increasing amounts of alcohol. So I'm sure they struggled to find volunteers for that.
Yeah.
And then compared that with how long people have been awake for. And what they found was that after you've been awake for 18 hours, your cognitive performance is as bad as if you were legally drunk in most European countries. Wow. So it's a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05.
Wow.
But if you think about this, I mean, not everyone consumes alcohol, but some people do. If you think about what's happened when you've kind of had a few drinks, suddenly you think you're funny, you think your jokes are fantastic, you think you've got the brightest idea. It's kind of you deceiving yourself. And unfortunately, I think that's true sometimes when we don't sleep enough and we've been awake for these long periods. It's like working from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. So, in that example you described, those all-nighters, we convince ourselves that we're doing good work, but actually it's often in quite an impaired state.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, James, you talked about the physical performance, cognitive performance. Does it change when you throw leadership in there from a cognitive standpoint? Because you talked earlier on an example if you're working on a strategy or a paper and you're thinking, and so that's more sitting at your desk and thinking long term. But what about when you're under pressure, you're a leader, or even just the fact that you're carrying the weight of a leader? Does that change at all or affect our performance as well?
Absolutely. And I would say that it's potentially even more critical for leaders. there was another interesting study that looked specifically at how sleep influenced leaders' ability to inspire. And they compared when leaders had slept 5 hours versus 7 hours, and how inspirational their teams rated them as. And they found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, when leaders had only slept for 5 hours, their teams rated them as significantly less inspirational. And it seems that the reason for this is that when we haven't slept enough as leaders, we're more likely to engage in something called surface acting. And that's just a technical way, a psychological way of describing that we might communicate the same thing, but we come across as more superficial. And again, I think, as leaders, sometimes we think we can get away with it. We want to get away with it. To some extent we can, but some of that quality of the interaction, that presence, which is so critical to effective leadership, that ability to inspire, to motivate, is limited by inadequate sleep. And so it becomes even more important at that cognitive level for leaders, because it's these very subtle capabilities related to how we think, how we are able to articulate our thoughts, which then our teams, the people we lead, interpret as presence, interpret as being engaged. It actually has this cascading effect, either for good or, unfortunately, a cascading negative effect if we're not as present as we could be.
Interesting. So can you define, when you talk about high performance, James, the difference between perfectionism and high performance, and where does it tends to take us towards? I assume high performance tends to drive us towards that sense of perfectionism. How do they differentiate? What's the difference between the two, and how do you? I'm assuming perfectionism isn't necessarily a healthy place to go. So how do you avoid going there, or is that where we need to go?
No, I think it's such an important distinction, because I think many of us do struggle with perfectionism. Now, the interesting thing is there are different types of perfectionism. So one of the most important distinctions is between self-orientated perfectionism, having perhaps some reasonably high standards for ourselves, but then also other-oriented perfectionism, which means that we think other people have excessively high standards for us. And there's definitely a fine line between wanting to excel and that becoming unhealthy perfectionism. And the literature seems quite clear on this, that we can avoid, because I do think that we should avoid an unhealthy level of perfectionism, but somehow find a way to excel. But we can avoid that by tempering that drive to excel with self-compassion. And part
that's
of
an
that,
interesting word. So
that and compassion, and so being recognizing the fact that we are fallible, and some of this is about being kind to ourselves, being open about some of the things we struggle with. Some of this comes down to accountability and community, and I think these can act as buffers that can temper that tendency towards perfectionism, because I think a lot of leaders do struggle with it. I mean, there's actually data at a population level that suggests that perfectionism as a tendency is increasing societally, and I think there's a number of different reasons that could be. But for me, that kind of that compassion piece is really critical to avoid the healthy drive to excel, to avoid it becoming what we might call maladaptive or unhealthy. There's another kind of framework that's quite useful in this as well. It's called the character strengths framework. Some people may have come across it, perhaps you have, but it's a typology that describes 24 character strengths divided into 6 virtues. And it's based on a really extensive body of research that was conducted globally and cross-culturally to describe these enduring characteristics which we share as humans. But it's got this very helpful notion of what they call a golden mean, which describes how for all our character strengths, there's a sweet spot that represents the best of us. But if we're not careful, we can fall into overuse or underuse of those strengths. Now, to give you an example of that, my number one character strength is curiosity. I just love learning new things. I've got this deep passion and this love of learning. And it's rare, but I can underuse that. It might happen most if I'm tired, if I haven't been recovering. But for me, that would look like disinterest, which is really contrary to who I am. However, it can also be overused. If I'm over-caffeinated and a bit too excited, then instead of focusing in on the thing that I need to learn and develop in, I'll just be all over the place, trying to learn everything and lost in Google searches of random ideas and rabbit holes. And so in the same way as perfectionism can become maladaptive, that drive to excel, it can be quite helpful, I think, particularly as leaders, for us to almost do a bit of an audit of all these different traits these characteristics that really can support us as leaders, that can help us to be effective, that can have a cascading positive effect on our teams, and identify the risks, the potential kind of negative sides of these characteristics and traits, and start to become more aware of where we might tip into either overuse or underuse, and then figure out ways to temper it. And so, for example, self-compassion with perfectionism, for me, a curiosity tempered with self-control. And there's ways to kind of break it down and think about that in each individual's context.
Yeah, fascinating. So one of the first places I saw you, James, you were doing a talk, you had a contraption on your head that was kind of measuring I'm trying to remember, was it the level of stress or what was kind of going on in your brain as you were giving a talk? And it was a fascinating thing to watch and listen to you describe. And so part of what, sometimes as a leader, sometimes as somebody that's speaking publicly, you're doing more cognitive work. You're not doing the same as you were doing when you were doing physical work, riding a bike, but you walk away from that experience feeling almost equally tired. And then you think, man, what's wrong with me? I wasn't doing anything physically. And so are you finding that cognitive work can be as tiring as physical work? And describe a little more what you were doing with the device on your head and what that's taught you.
So yeah, the device that you're describing, you're right, it's called an EEG headset. That stands for electroencephalography.
Okay.
And essentially, it's a way of measuring the electrical activity on your scalp, which is actually giving you an idea of what's going on with the electrical activity of the neurons in your brain, so the brain cells. And we can describe that activity in what's called brainwave frequency bands. And one way to think about this metaphorically is it's a bit like having a speedometer for your brain, because you can divide these brainwave frequency bands into, at one end of the spectrum, delta waves, very slow waves. You'd only expect to see those during deep sleep, so hopefully not during one of my presentations. And then at the top end, you've got these kind of beta, high beta, gamma waves. And so by measuring brain activity when people are engaged in different tasks, you start to get this insight into what is happening during that task. And we've got an idea of figuring out, what is the optimal mix of those brainwave bands for different types of activities. So to give you a very practical example, if you were to sit in back-to-back meetings, you start to see what's called high beta brainwave activity. So you talk about stress, and when someone is stressed, you start to see high beta, this high beta. And you might also see a phenomenon called negative frontal alpha asymmetry, which is basically a sophisticated way of saying you're less engaged. And so we don't want to see that. But the amazing thing is, if you then help people to take breaks between meetings, you actually see the opposite. You see the brain activity shift into this, what's called low beta, which is actually an indication of less negative stress. And then positive frontal alpha asymmetry, which is this indication of higher engagement. And so these technologies are helpful because it gives us another data point. Now, some people say, self-report surveys are too subjective and we want to ignore them. We just want to use this hard neurophysiological data. I don't agree. I think these different data sources have each got their place. But the nice thing is, if you're working with a group of people or even an individual, you can start to help people to see that there are real tangible physiological effects from the way that we live and work. And so in your example that you just described about, the effort and the fatigue that's associated with speaking, that's real. There's a high cognitive load. We can measure that high beta brainwave activity, for example. There's quite a high switching cost because you're thinking about engaging with the audience, remembering your content, thinking about your delivery. But the brain is actually quite an energy demanding tissue. So it's got incredible energy demands, and there's a real energy cost when you're thinking intensely for extended periods. So that's just one tool that we can use to provide people with a new insight into what's really going on beneath the surface, which I think for some people, particularly for leaders, not that we should need permission, but sometimes knowing that there's a real physical effect from this cognitive work can help people to maybe be a bit more compassionate and actually say, well, this is why I'm tired and this is why I need a break. It's not just kind of in my head. I'm not imagining it.
Yeah, interesting. So I feel like, though, James, there's almost a sense of pride in I can do more, or I can do work and I'm not tired, or it doesn't affect me. And so what would you say to somebody? Because I feel like even culturally, we'll almost brag about how busy we are. We don't have time off. I'm doing so much work, and almost embarrassed to say, oh, I actually just took the day off, or I took an evening off, or whatever it may be. So how do you challenge leaders that seem to almost feel like it's wrong to step back from the day-to-day grind?
I think that is a challenge that I think many of us would relate to, because there are some real qualities and associated with perseverance, is how I describe what you're describing.
And I was really proud of that. Yes.
Yeah, and some of that is good, because working hard, seeing results, serving, persevering, again, it's a quality that can result in some really fantastic outcomes potentially. But I often challenge leaders if they are, maybe falling into that trap of taking pride in never taking a break, never having taking days off, to really get honest and say, if I was to ask your partner, a close friend, a colleague, about how this perseverance is showing up in the world and what effect it's having, what would they say to me? Would you still have that same level of pride?
Yeah.
Now, sometimes maybe they would, but very often, if you ask them that question, they'd probably say, well, when I missed like my kid's soccer game at the weekend, they probably wouldn't say that was great. I mean, it even comes down to the smaller things. It would say, so, if I had a kind of secret camera watching you having dinner with your family or with friends, what would that secret camera see? And, very often it shows someone who's distracted, who's struggling to be present, who then, feels guilty about that. And I think really when we get honest with ourselves, that as much as kind of at a high level, maybe on a different podcast, or, we talk about, the grind and the hustle and it's celebrated. If you do just peel back the layers, most people recognize that that's probably not the healthiest or most sustainable way to live. And part of what I would do is just to gently encourage that conversation and that self-awareness, because often it's coming out of, that drive, that perseverance has got good intentions behind it. People want to do something good in the world, but as I said, sometimes it can get overused and then end up having negative effects.
So it almost feels like you're going a little bit towards balance in life, and we hear all the time about just work-life balance, and yet it seems to me that people that are truly high performers, they're making sacrifices somewhere, and so you're not necessarily saying, okay, let's try to keep everything even keel. Otherwise, I'm not sure would ever perform at a high level. Am I mistaken on that, or is that?
Not at all. I think that's spot on, because the reality is, if you want to achieve something great, you would have a big impact. There will be costs. You think about when I was a racing cyclist, and you think about professional cyclists at the top level, there is nothing balanced about kind of wearing a lycra suit and throwing yourself off a mountain and go at 100 kilometers an hour. Like, it's not, but you believe it's worth it. And so one of the things I'd often challenge myself with, people I work with, leaders that I know, is be cognizant, be aware and conscious of those sacrifices, and make sure that it's genuinely worth it. Because my approach to performance is, it's really about being clear about when it's worth going all in, and then when it's time to step back. I've had the privilege to work quite a lot in Formula One, a sport that's growing in interest and awareness in the United States now. And there's this kind of misconception sometimes when people watch a Formula One race where they're getting up to speeds of over 200 kilometers an hour, that they're like pedal to the metal, like full gas all the time. But actually, that's not true. They're very aware, they're incredibly aware of the times when they really need to push, and then the times where they need to brake and take it easy. This is all that tire management to get technical. And I think there's a general principle there that if we want to achieve that true sustained performance, to meet those demands that we're facing in life and work, it's important to know when is the time to go full gas. But I would argue that it's equally important, perhaps more, to also know when to back off. And so rather than thinking about balance, what I really advocate for is having a very clear understanding of where you need to really push and go all in, and then when you need to back off. Because as you say, I think trying to achieve this perfect equilibrium, I think it's actually a myth.
Yeah. James, thank you for speaking with us. Excited for you to be talking at the summit here. That's going to be coming up real soon. And excited for our listeners to be able to just apply some of the things that you're talking about. If people want to hear more of what you're doing, is there a place that they should go specifically to be able to connect with you more?
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to share that. So one is my website, which is drjameshewitt.com. And I'm also very active on LinkedIn. And so share lots of these ideas and really welcome the opportunity to hear people's thoughts. So I really would welcome the opportunity to continue the discussion on those platforms.
Great. James, thank you. Appreciate you very much. And again, looking forward to hearing you at the summit in just a few weeks.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it too.
Thank you.
So, how are you feeling? Because I don't know about you, but I found myself exhaling a little bit during that conversation. James reminded me that high performance isn't about pushing harder. It's about finding better rhythms. It's about knowing when to rest. It's about recognizing that the work we do with our minds is just as demanding as the work athletes do with their bodies. And if that's true, then friend, you have full permission to build in moments of recovery. So here's a challenge for us. What's one simple practice you can add into this week to recover well? It doesn't have to be big. Maybe it's 5 minutes to step away. Maybe it's a pause in your day that you fiercely, and you'll probably have to fiercely protect it. Start small and start now. My practice this week was to take a break and write a card to a friend and letting her know that I see her in a hard season. That filled my creative tank. I'm also going to try really hard to get 7 hours of sleep. That's probably going to mean that I need to put my phone down sooner in the evening and find a new nighttime routine. If this episode encouraged you, make sure to share it with someone who needs it. And if you want more conversations like this, you have got to be a part of the 2025 Global Leadership Summit. You will hear from leaders like James and leave with actionable insight to fuel your leadership all year long. You can head to globalleadership.org/summit. That's globalleadership.org/summit for all the details. And ticket prices go up July 17th. So do not miss your lowest ticket price. Okay, friends, that's it for this week. We are all getting so excited for the summit. We hope you join us. And until next time, remember this: everyone has influence, so lead where you are.